I would just like to introduce finally our very own Rasmus Bertelsen, who will be participating, as you can see, online. Rasmus is a professor of Northern Studies and is the Barents Chair in Politics at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. And he's also the former Nansen Professor of Arctic Studies here at the University of Akureyri. Nansen, you have the floor. Rasmus, you have the floor.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Can you see and hear me? Friedrich, can you see and hear me?
It's loud and clear.
Good. Yeah. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very sorry I can't be there with you. And there was a question. About Svalbard, and I'm actually sitting in Longyearbyen in Svalbard. So while Njord and the Matt are sitting there in the sweet south with daylight and everything, pretending to be Arctic, I mean, I'm sitting here in the polar night with polar bears roaming outside my window. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to join you. And I'm very happy to add my observations to what has already been said. So that we can be on time, I'll be as quick as I can. And what I want to talk about is the Arctic in a larger world order, and it perhaps follows more what Njord was talking about. And you can see here the title I proposed, a NATO BRICS-Divided Arctic in a NATO BRICS-Divided World, or the subtitle, Why the Arctic Never Was and Nor Ever Will Be Exceptional. So what I want to talk about, and hopefully have time for a question or two, is that I'll introduce myself briefly, and then I will briefly outline how the Arctic historically and today, and I think in the future, is closely integrated into international order and reflects international order. And that means that if we know international order, we also know something about how the Arctic looks and how the Arctic develops. So we had Cold War bipolarity also in the Arctic. Then we had post-Cold War US unipolarity hegemony, which is the basis of the Arctic we have now. And then that post-Cold War order is coming to an end. We see signs of Sino-American bipolarity. And of course, Russia is striving for multipolarity, as Russia has been very clear about since the 1990s. Global order is changing. It's changing in economics, it's changing in science and technology, and it's changing in legitimacy. And that is all shaping the background for Arctic order. And what we see as a response to these changes to world order, it's a Sino-Russian Western decoupling in the Arctic and in general. And finally, a few remarks about the future of global governance in general and concerning the Arctic. I trust that you can see my screen. Well, yeah, good. Let me first briefly introduce myself. I am a Danish national born in Denmark, but as you can see, I lived as a child in Iceland, in Reykjavik, and I also studied in Iceland a couple of years. So I speak reasonable Icelandic, and Iceland is in many ways home to me. And I was extremely happy to be Nansen professor at University of Akureyri in 2022 and 2023. It was, I felt very much at home. This line of pictures, it's of course me on an Icelandic horse sometime in the 1980s. Many of the Icelandic audience will recognize Vilborg Dagbjörnsdóttir, the important Icelandic poet, who was one of my very important teachers in Østerbøskolen in Reykjavik in the mid-1980s. Vilborg, who made a big influence on me, and I just mentioned here that Icelandic school teachers are very poorly paid, and they often have several jobs. And Vilborg also taught Icelandic both in the Chinese and Soviet embassies in Reykjavik, and the observations from inside those embassies she shared with me, for example, at the last years of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, to me, it really showed the importance of engaging the other side very closely to have a very deep insight into the other side. Of course, the picture is in the middle is the old gymnasium in Reykjavik, which the Icelanders will know well. You recognize the then president of Iceland, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, and me in '96. And of course, the last picture is from the opening of the China-Iceland Arctic Observatory at Kárholt in October 2018. And the Chinese gentleman is, of course, then Director General of the Polar Research Institute of China, Dr. Yang Huigen. So in many ways, there's a direct line from the boy on the horse to the last picture. And as I say, Iceland is very much home to me, and I have been very, very much inspired by the Icelandic tradition of travel for education, travel for experience, what in Icelandic is called a sigla, to sail. I have the opportunity to regularly teach in China and collaborate on research. There's a Chinese term, my very poor pronunciation would be haigui, which is a Chinese wordplay, sea turtles, Chinese who have gone abroad and returned, and they have shaped Chinese society very much for the last more than 100 years. There's also another saying that goes something like it's as good to travel 10,000 miles as to read 10,000 books. I appreciate that thinking very much. I don't know similar sayings in Danish or Norwegian, but I always encourage students to travel as much as they possibly can. And while I have been making these remarks, you may have quickly run through my personal background for what is my background. So the Arctic in international order. So in the Cold War, we had a bipolar system because we had two superpowers. Therefore, we had a realist order. Now, that system was not globalized. It was very little integrated. So these two powers only had to concern themselves with nuclear arms control. The West had its bounded order with the organizations I mentioned, which were also present in the Nordic, North American Arctic. And the Soviet Union had its organization, and we, of course, had the Soviet Arctic. So we had the Arctic clearly reflecting the international order. Then the United States wins the Cold War, and the Soviet Union loses the Cold War, leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in '91, Christmas '91, and a very, very deep crisis of Russian society. I think the estimation is that Russian society contracted something like 30–40% economically at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So then we had a unipolar order with the United States as the single liberal superpower, and therefore we had a liberal order. Various Western institutions, they either became global or expanded, and that was the basis of what I would call the circumpolar liberal Arctic order. circumpolar because it included Russia, liberal, not in the political sense, but in the international relations theoretical sense of concerning itself with liberal topics as science, environment, indigenous people, people-to-people cooperation, and not state security. That's a realist order. And of course, that was the basis for these organizations that we saw from the 1990s, the Arctic Council, the International Arctic Science Committee, the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, the Bering Corporation, etc. And we in the West, some people had very strong expectations and hopes that that was the end of history. We had won the Cold War, and that was supposed to be the end of history. Instead of the end of history, we had the return of history, and we had the return of the rest as opposed to the West. And if we look at the demographics, you can see the circle saying there are more people living inside this circle than outside of it. If you see the table to the right from the Asian Development Bank, and of course, the world economy today is almost infinitely larger than in the 1700s. But you see that up to the 1700s, 1800s, Asia, that's not China alone, it's Asia, including the Indian subcontinent, etc., was more than half of world economic activity. That contracts very much with Western dominance, and remember, these are relative figures. But according to these predictions, Asia will represent more than half of world economic output again in 2050. So as I tell my Nordic students, they will spend their careers in a world that becomes less familiar. And as I remarked to my Chinese students, that they are perhaps spending their career in a world that becomes more familiar. We see this data very quickly that you can see in 95, of course, the G7 was a much larger share of the world economy than the BRICS countries. And today, and that is before the expansion of the BRICS bloc, they are a larger part of the world economy in terms of purchasing power parity. You see here, if we look at it per capita, then of course the G7 countries are much, much wealthier. But because the BRICS countries have much larger populations, as they become wealthier per capita, then of course the effects, the relative global effect will be very, very strong. This change in world order is also in science and technology and knowledge. This is science and engineering papers, and this is American data. You have the high income economies, well, they grow, but of course, the very strong growth in science and engineering papers is from the upper middle income economies, which are largely the BRICS economies. If we see it in more detail, here on this side here, you can see that the green is China. You see a strong growth there. The blue is the United States. It's very stable. And of course, countries like the United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, it's very stable. We also see it here. It's not just a question of quantity. It's also a question of quality, that here articles in the top 1% most cited journal articles, where we see stability for the United States. We do see some European growth, which is good, but of course we see strong Chinese and Indian growth. And we also have a global change in terms of legitimacy. So global order both rests on the relative distribution of material power, but global order also rests on legitimacy. And there, I don't think there's any doubt that we in the West have largely overestimated our legitimacy and our credibility in the rest of the world. But now with the with the violence we see in Gaza right now and the proceedings we see at the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court initiated by countries as South Africa, Mexico, Chile, Indonesia, which are of course exactly these BRICS-style countries, we see a very marked shift in global legitimacy. So that is to, how to say, put the global picture. And there, American unipolarity after the Cold War was also the basis of globalization. And now, of course, we are seeing a kind of retrenchment of that globalization. We have been talking, myself, a lot about the global Arctic, and are we going to see a post-global Arctic? So there, now, if we look at the world's two largest national economies by far, which are, of course, the United States and the People's Republic of China, if we look at the world's two largest science and technology systems, they are also by far the United States and the People's Republic of China. So in that respect, we have bipolarity. And then the theoretical prediction will be that we see that these competing superpowers will form orders, so-called bounded orders, to harness the resources of their allies and also to discipline their allies. And then, of course, of special concern for the Arctic, the question is, and this was already an evident question before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine almost 2 years ago, the question would, of course, be where would Russia fall between the American-led order and the Chinese-led order? And of course, the war in Ukraine clearly answers that question. Before that war, well, if Russia had fallen in a Western-led order, we would have had a circumpolar Arctic. And now we very much have this Arctic, which is divided between the US-led NATO Arctic, and Sweden is, for all practical purposes, a member of NATO. So on the one side, we have the Arctic 7 NATO states, clear American leadership. And on the other side, we have Russia. And of course, Russia turns all it can economically, scientifically, technologically to the BRICS. So I want to leave sufficient time for questions. So I'm being efficient in my presentation. One way to look at the international system today and international politics, I think a lot in international politics today is driven by this triangle between the United States, China, and Russia. And of course, we have marked conflicts between the United States and China that concern not least Taiwan and the South China Sea. In Russia, between the United States and Russia, we of course have the Ukraine war. And these very poor relations between the United States and China and the United States and Russia, they of course affect the third side of this triangle, where China and Russia, they lean on each other for matters of energy, minerals, food, strategic technologies, space questions, early warning technology, missile defense technology. And then if we look at the rest of the world, what the BRICS plus countries, but also what is called the MINT countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, well, of course, they have all kinds of strong relations with the United States, but they also have with China, and of course, they keep so with Russia. We see very clearly the voting in the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations General Assembly. We see the diverging views on the war in Ukraine, and now with the violence in Gaza, the voting at the United Nations shows quite clearly this world divided between what I would call a NATO plus world. So NATO plus Australia, New Zealand, to some extent Japan and South Korea, and the rest. And where do we have Europe and the Nordics and the Arctic in that? Well, I think we have to say we have them up there in the corner. And of course, we have a very strong transatlantic relationship, but we also have very clear American leadership in that relationship. And of course, the opposite of leadership is dependence. So European dependence on the United States for defense, for technology, and also an intellectual dependence. The European-Chinese relationship, which is increasingly reduced to the commercial relationship. I've had the opportunity to take part a good deal in Sino-Nordic academic relations for about 12 years. And that's another discussion, but that seems to be diminishing. I'm concerned for not strong enough relations between Europe and the Nordics and the rest of the world. And of course, the relations with Russia are practically gone. So that's the context, that's the global context. So to conclude, the United States is understandably very determined to keep the post-Cold War order, an order of American predominance. And that is what is usually called the rules-based order. But, as I said, order rests both on material power and legitimacy. And as is clear, the legitimacy is sliding, and humanity today is 8 billion people, rising to 10 billion people. The West is about 1 billion people, and it will stay at 1 billion people. And when the others become richer with stronger science, stronger technology, that world will slide. If we continue down that road, I do not see a change to the Arctic we have now. The Arctic will remain divided between what I call this US-led NATO Arctic and the Russian Arctic, where, of course, Russia seeks all the BRICS economic and science and technology engagement it can. The alternative, which is, of course, opening a very large question, is how does global governance look for a world where both material and immaterial power is distributed very differently? Inventing a governance system for that would be almost unimaginable. Well, fortunately, we do have the UN system with the Charter, the Security Council, the General Assembly, and all the specialized agencies of the United Nations. And that, of course, raises the question, what will Arctic governance look like in such a radically different multipolar world? And I'll conclude here, but let me just finish on one point, and that is the Arctic we had for the last 30 years rested on a post-Cold War international order. That post-Cold War international order is not coming back. So there's no way back to the Arctic we had before 2 years ago. Thank you very much for your attention.
I once again open the floor for questions. Anyone have any questions? So we could start with a question from the online participants. So given this polarity, an anonymous attendee asks, to what extent will Russia accept and or tolerate a Chinese physical presence beyond financial investment within the Arctic?
The Arctic is absolutely crucial for Russia's both defense and also its economy. So Russia will defend its Arctic very vigorously towards anybody. But of course, they are financially very dependent. Well, I mean, until the Crimean annexation, until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it was very clear Russia was aiming for a balanced energy system concerning trade and investment, with energy going west to Europe, going east to East Asia, and with both European and East Asian capital. And now, of course, the western leg of that system has been cut off, both in terms of the trade and the capital and the technology. And that, of course, makes Russia much more dependent on especially the Chinese leg. Also, India is a very important actor in this. There's much speculation about Chinese military presence in the Arctic. I'm very skeptical about those speculations. So China and the United States have an ever increasingly, tense relationship. And of course, between nuclear weapon states, they have a very different way of thinking than, for example, Nordic countries, which do not have nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapon states always have to think all the way to Armageddon. So how does a war over Taiwan end with Sino-American use of nuclear weapons against each other? And there, of course, the Sino-American mutual nuclear deterrence is absolutely key. And the Arctic plays an important role in that. Think about all the missile defense infrastructure in Alaska. But I don't see the purpose for China of basing strategic missile submarines in the Arctic. They cannot get into the Arctic undetected. The Bering Strait is very shallow. It's fully controlled by the United States and Russia. Are the Chinese submarines supposed to sail all the way south of Africa or South America? And they're going to have no protection, no support. I mean, I think the Chinese nuclear deterrence is going to be based on land-based missiles, which are being very much expanded now, and submarine-based in the Bohai Sea and close to China. I mean, for me, it's very hard to imagine a Chinese military presence in the Arctic. Thank you.
Pass the speaker over to Ampla.
Hello, Rasmus. This is Ampla.
Well,
thank you for your presentation. We're missing you already here in Akureyri. I hope you're enjoying Svalbard. It sounds cold and dark, even more so than here. I'm wondering, because you discussed the potential of a divided governance structure in the Arctic 7 on one hand, and Russia and whomever they choose to cozy up to on the other hand. In my mind, this is a recipe for disaster for the future of the region. Could you perhaps elaborate or share your insight on what that could mean for the next few decades?
Well, I mean, the disaster, the big and small disasters. Of course, the Nordic countries, the United States and Canada, I mean, we are very similar countries in terms of societies, values, culture, etc. I had the opportunity before to also participate in Norwegian-Russian academic relations. And of course, Russia was perhaps the exotic other before in many Arctic settings. I think what I have noticed in Arctic conferences since February 2022, it is how quickly you forget about the Russian Arctic, how quickly you forget about the Russian collaboration, the Russian participation. And as I say, I mean, between the Nordic countries and the Canada and the United States, it's almost too easy to get along. I mean, we can sit next week, Arctic Frontiers, next week at Arctic Frontiers in Tromsø very nicely, and Arctic Circle in Reykjavik, etc., etc. So that's perhaps a smaller catastrophe. When it comes to, for example, climate science, well, as has been pointed out, that you cannot build these global models if you don't have global input of data. And there, I mentioned the importance of the United Nations system. As you may have noticed in my introduction, that I spent a couple of years with the United Nations University in Japan. I became a great fan of the UN system of multilateralism. And for example, the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva is, as far as I know, one of the very few places where that kind of data can be exchanged today. Then we have, I have mentioned nuclear deterrence, I've mentioned arms control, strategic stability. We're talking about the destruction of mankind in the very worst case scenario. And of course, arms control and deterrence and strategic stability are diplomatically, scientifically, technologically extremely demanding endeavors, which require, I think, diplomatic, scientific, technological knowledge shared between the two sides at the very highest level. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had very sophisticated arms control diplomacy. That's perhaps why humanity is still here. And it's very hard to manage these very dangerous things if you don't have a very, very strong intellectual connection with your counterpart. And that has nothing to do with what you otherwise think about that counterpart. Thank you.
Our online participants more and more, but I'm fearing that you have to leave in a minute and a half, no?
No, actually, well, I was supposed to continue somewhere else here in Longyearbyen, but I've canceled that, so I have more leeway.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's excellent. So an interesting question here. So Sanata is asking, in quotes, my inquiry is centered on the implications of a divided approach to Arctic governance and its potential impact on the development of the Northern Sea Route. Would this division impact the economic development of the Northern Sea Route in the upcoming years? And how so?
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, as I say, I think it was clear from especially the huge Yamal liquefied natural gas project that Russia, before the Crimean annexation of Crimea, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia was very deliberately seeking such a balanced system going east and west, and it's not going west anymore. And that, of course, means that it will be more and more dominated by BRICS economic interests, BRICS science, BRICS technology. The West, understandably, has been trying to slow down Russian activities, Russian economy, through financial sanctions, through technological sanctions. And I think, for example, the Yamal LNG project was very dependent on Western technology. And I think there were headlines recently about now that you have more and more advanced Chinese technology being shipped there. And I have the opportunity to visit for research, visit for guest teaching, top institutions in Beijing and Shanghai. And I mean, when you see the size of the talent pool, when you see the talent, well, then it's not surprising that eventually, of course, such a huge talent pool with resources will catch up.
Perfect, thank you. A round of applause for Rasmus. Thank you again. We're